Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing my ongoing discussion and analysis into human rights. Specifically, I'm going to continue the discussion that I left off in the previous maybe hour and a half on torture, sort of the complications that arise in either attempting to deny torture, and we talked about what those denials might look like. There might be a literal denial. There might be, I forget the second, it was like inferential or interpretive denial, and the final might be an implicatory denial. Today what we're going to talk about primarily are the conceptual elements that you need in order to classify an act as an act of torture. And one of the key components, as we said before, was the notion of custody. So we'll talk about that more today, also about custodianship and sort of the way that in which nations legitimize, or the torturers, quote unquote, legitimize the act that they're participating in. So with that, let's begin. This is section 5.1 of the analysis. This is human rights. And this is section 5.1. Okay. So I want to begin with a quote, and my book is over there. I want to begin with a quote. Quote, this is the top of page 11 in the notes. Also, you guys should know, if you want to get access to the notes, click the banner ad that pops up. It'll take you to the PDF, download the notes, or click the link in the description box. It'll also take you to the PDF download. Follow along, right in the margins. Okay, so contrary to implications of some, the forced public nakedness, forced public masturbation, and forced simulation of homosexual acts depicted in Abu Ghraib photos do not qualify as torture, right? The fact that individuals were forced to do these many things, that does not qualify as an act of torture. What was done in Iraq, what was done to the Iraqi detainees was torture because, right, so torture, it was torture because the detainees were in the custody of the U.S. military and private contractors. So as we said before, this idea of custody is extremely important in conceptually understanding the obvious human rights violation of torture from way back, maybe about 4 or 5 hours ago in the lecture. One of the very first things that I said was the attempt to make distinctions between first, second, and third generation human rights. And we saw that in first generation human rights, the agent is attempting to have a right from, and torture was one of the things that distinguished a first generation right, the right from, right? I have a right from not being tortured. I don't want those in power, political power or whatever other power, establishments of power there might be, to use and abuse that authority, use and abuse that power to torture me, right? So the first thing that we recognize is keyly that we're talking about custody. Okay, so it's not that it was forced public masturbation, forced public nakedness, forced humiliation, that in and of itself qualified the act as an act of torture. What qualifies the act of torture were that the detainees were in the custody of the U.S. military and private contractors because they were compelled by their captors to assume humiliating positions, and because they were powerless to resist the humiliation, right? So this idea of powerlessness, right? They were powerless to resist their humiliation. While the detainees' cultural sensitivities were undoubtedly offended, right? Knowing that there are cultural taboos, given that, then the argument that the author is saying here is that it's precisely to infringe upon those taboos, to enforce those taboos, to allow or to force the detainees to participate in taboo acts that in and of itself doesn't necessarily constitute torture. But the fact that the detainees were in custody, they were powerless, there was nowhere for them to go, they had to do it, that is, according to the author, what constitutes the act of torture. While the detainees' cultural sensitivities were undoubtedly offended, the relative point is that the most inalienable of their human rights was violated by their American jailers. And that's page 84 of the text. Let me actually get the book. Again, we're using the human rights in the world community in page 84 out of that text. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk conceptual elements that we'll need in order to classify an act as an act of torture. So, conceptual elements that we need to classify an act as an act of torture. What I'm saying here, is that the list of 6 characteristics, one, I'm not saying that it's exhaustive, that all 6 of these points in and of themselves allow one to identify an act or classify an act as an act of torture. That's not my intent. What I'm doing is synthesizing a lot of the information from the text out of the book that I just showed, and also secondary resources that I've used in order to compile my notes to get at these sort of 6 points. With respect to that, it's important to recognize also that any individual point isn't enough to classify the act as an act of torture. It's sort of the collection, right? Meaning that it's not necessary. I mean that it is necessary, but it's not sufficient. The collection of these acts in totality, when used within the custody of someone who has power over the powerless, over the detainee, that constitutes an act of torture. So the first one is the international infliction of pain and suffering, humiliation, etc. Or the intentional, sorry. So the intentional infliction of pain So the intentional infliction of pain, humiliation, ... Right? So when we're talking about an act of torture, you'll notice that there is an intentional infliction of pain and an intentional humiliation. And we'll talk about that. As we just saw in the quote from page 84 out of the text, the intentional infliction of pain, the intentional humiliation in and of itself isn't enough to constitute an act as an act of torture. As the author said, it is only in the combination with having custodianship over a detainee that the act then constitutes an act of torture. So pain, the intentional infliction or the forced infliction of pain and humiliation and suffering in and of itself isn't a sufficient condition to satisfy torture. It's in addition to the concept of custodianship that we can then talk about conceptions of torture. Number 2, public officials, non-state actors, or civilians with, quote, the capacity to take people into custody, right? Very, very important, right? The capacity to take people into, right? It's this idea of having the power. It's extremely important that we recognize that insofar as we're talking about an act of torture, people will say, well, really it's just political regimes or governments or militia forces or paramilitary forces, that participate in acts of torture. And that's not accurate, right? Some people would have problems delineating, and the author talks about this, I don't think I put it in the notes, but I remember reading it. The author says, well, in that act you can look at instances of domestic violence and domestic abuse, sort of horrendous acts of domestic abuse and domestic violence, and it's hard to make a distinction between domestic abuse and violence and acts of torture, right? There might be humiliation of the spouse, there might be sexual abuse of the spouse, there might be physical abuse of the spouse. How is that any different from torture? And the answer is custodianship, right? There has to be the capacity to take someone into custody. So, very, very important point in number 2. Number 3, detainee was in the custodianship